Welcome to No Rares Required, Episode 11, All Will Be One, the new Magic the Gathering set that just dropped on Arena today. Usually I discuss a drafting strategy for a specific color pair or archetype, but today I will be covering my favorite commons and uncommons, going over the set's mechanics and what each archetype is trying to do in a broad sense. I'm really excited about this new set, and I think it is going to be a good one for draft, so let's dive right in. Now, usually I start my podcast with the best common and move down the list, but today we're just going to be the ones that caught my attention and the reasons why. So there's no reasoning to their order other than alphabetical. So to start, we have Charge of the Mites. I think this is going to be a common that performs very well because it is both removal and also a go wide strategy in one card. It's a 2 and a white to either deal damage to a creature or planeswalker equal to the number of creatures you control, or to create 2 1/1 mites, which have toxic but can't block. Which brings me to the first mechanic, toxic. Toxic creatures that deal combat damage to a player give them a poison counter, and if they reach 10 poison counters, they lose the game. And white, as a color, has a go wide theme as well, so this card fits right in. Next up, we have Crawling Chorus, a 1/1 toxic creature for 1 white that when it dies, it creates a mite. One of the things that I like about white is that it feels like it's going to be a very aggressive color, and so cards like Crawling Chorus help get the poison counters started early when your opponent may not have defenses set up. It's spawning a mite also when it dies fits the go wide strategy. Complete Devotion also stood out to me at the common level. It is 1 and a white to give target creature you control +2/+2, and if the creature has toxic, you get to draw a card. Usually a +2/+2 combat trick for 2 is bad. Even good old Giant Growth, which is +3/+3 for 1 green, is not great in Modern Limited, but this drawing a card is huge. As long as your deck has enough creatures that have toxic, I think this will be a great trick and a card to keep in mind when you're playing with white. And I also think the set feels very aggressive. So if you're going to be pushing plenty of early damage, this card helps you do just that. Fencing Raptor also caught my attention. Once your opponent has started to set up their defenses, those 1/1 mites or 1/1 Crawling Chorus are going to be more difficult to get through to keep the poison counters rolling. Fencing Raptor costs 2 and a white for a 2/2 flying toxic creature, so basically a toxic wind drake. But when it enters the battlefield, another creature with toxic gets +1/+1, and most importantly, gains flying until end of turn. This hopefully gives you the evasion against your opponent's defenses and helps to keep ticking towards that 10 poison counters. Planar Disruption is the last white common that really stands out to me. It is a 2-cost arrest, but enchantment removal, like pacifism, can be second rate depending on the set. If there's a lot of sacrifice or ways to continue to gain value out of the creature, then I tend to not like it very much. But this set seems very aggressive, so removing a problematic blocker can be just what I need to continue to push damage through, and maybe more importantly, poison counters. Now for the white uncommons. I think Annex Sentry is going to perform very well. I speculate that this format is going to be unforgiving for slow starts, and this card is great at creating a huge swing early in the game. If the matchup is dependent on who is getting poisoned first, for example, then this can help you slow your opponent down by removing one of their toxic creatures. Or it can be used to remove an early blocker so you can continue to push through with your toxic creatures. Jawbone Duelist is 1 and a white for a 1/1 double strike with toxic. So each time this creature hits an opponent, it's 2 poison counters. And with cards like Complete Devotion, the white combat trick I showed earlier, it's always going to be a tough decision for your opponent of whether or not they can afford to block or let the poison counters continue to rise. This is more my type of enchantment removal since it gets rid of the creature until the enchantment leaves the battlefield. Ossification is 1 and a white to exile target creature or planeswalker, and it enchants a basic land you control. Luckily, there hasn't been much land destruction in Magic for quite some time, so this plays as a 2-cost Banishing Light. It's cheap, efficient removal, and I'm guessing these will get picked up pretty quickly. Now for blue. Bring the Ending brings me to the next mechanic in the set. Corrupted. If your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, then they are corrupted, and there's a fair amount of cards that go from good to absolutely great once your opponent is corrupted, which I think is a really cool mechanic. In the past, it was always kind of a bummer when you went for the poison counter toxic strategy and fell short. So this opens up a bunch of strategies that just aim to get to the 3 counters, then win in a more traditional sense. Bringing the Ending costs 1 and a blue and plays as a quench, countering a spell unless your opponent pays 2 mana, which can be really good for interrupting the early game plays, which I think, again, will be quite important in this set. And it just gets better from there, because if they have Corrupted, it becomes a 2-cost counterspell that doesn't even have a double pip in blue. Experimental Augury seems like pretty cheap card draw at 2, and brings me to another of the set's mechanics, Proliferate. Proliferate allows you to add 1 more counter to any pre-existing counters. It is worth noting that there aren't any +1/+1 counters in the set, but we all know this is about those poison counters. If you don't have things that you want to proliferate, then this plays like Anticipate, which has been filler in previous sets. Malcator's Watcher is a 1/1 Vigilance flyer for 2, and when it dies, you get to draw a card. I think the set puts a lot of pressure on the first couple of turns, especially with the Corrupted mechanic. This allows you to trade with an early attacker while replacing itself. It may not be very important to stop your opponent before they hit the 3 poison counters, and if that is the case, then the value of this card goes down. But my first impression is that this will be worth running in multiples. Mesmerizing Dose also mesmerized me. 1 in double pip blue is going to reserve this for the decks that are mainly blue, and I know part of me is going to be tempted to play it when blue is my secondary color when I really shouldn't. But Charmed Sleep, which was 1 in double pip blue to permatap a creature, wasn't very impressive in AFR, but I think the Proliferate, similar to Experimental Augury, is going to make it much better. And I think Enchantment Removal is looking more appealing in this set as well. Distorted Curiosity is a divination, 2 in a blue to draw 2 cards, and that is at its worst. At its best, I think it will play very closely to Thoughtcast from Mirrodin as a single blue to draw 2 cards. So amazing at 1 mana, but still totally fine if you have to pay 3, is a good place to be. Serum Snare is 1 in a blue to bounce a permanent, and if that permanent costs 3 or less, then you get to proliferate. Bounce spells tend to play well in aggro and tempo-based strategies. If I completely misread the format and it turns out to be more about attrition, then this is less valuable. You can still use it to get a busted bomb back from a planar disruption, so I think it'll still see play if the format is slower than I anticipate. Tamiyo's Immobilizer is an artifact for 3 in a blue that enters with 4 oil counters and has tap, remove an oil counter to tap target creature or artifact. Oil is the other counter in the set that you're going to be looking to proliferate. Oil is primarily in Temur or blue, red, green, while proliferate is in Sultai or blue, black, green. But more on that later when we go over the specific archetypes. Now back to our budget Icy Manipulator. You can use this to lock down their best creature for as long as you can keep proliferating those oil counters. And you can also do the old tap on their instep, then again on your turn to remove 2 would-be blockers in 1 foul swoop. My gut says that this will see the most play in Dimir and Izzet, but like I said, more on that later. Unctus's Retrofitter is a toxic 2/3 for 2 in a blue. When it enters the battlefield, you get to make one of your artifacts into a 4/4 until Unctus leaves the battlefield. I think this card pairs well with Skull Bombs, the one-cost artifacts that range from great to trash, that we'll go over when we get to the artifacts. But it really shines with Malcator's Watcher, the 1/1 Vigilance Flyer I mentioned earlier. Being able to curve into a 4/4 flying Vigilance on turn 3 sounds pretty nice to me. Annihilating Glare, I think, is why they moved the Treachery or Treason of the set to uncommon. For a single black, you get to destroy target creature or planeswalker if you sacrifice an artifact or a creature or pay 4. I think with Skull Bombs, Mites, and other 1/1 tokens, you'll have plenty of fuel, and later in the game, using it as a 5-cost removal spell can work in a pinch. Anoint with Affliction might be the best removal in the set. Honestly, it might be the best removal at common that they've made in quite a long time, especially if you hit Corrupted. 2-cost exile target creature. I mean, come on. Before Corrupted, though, you have to exile something that costs 3 or less, which is still going to be great early in the game. Bonepicker Scourge is a 2/2 flyer for 2 and a black, so at its worst, it's a Windrake. And maybe it's because I played Magic back when Windrakes were great, or at least okay, but I think this card will play well, especially in Golgari or Orzhov. You're going to want to get Corrupted early, because without it, sadly Windrakes just don't make the cut in Modern Limited. Now for the uncommons, and a quick side note. I think black is the strongest color. I put my rankings as black, white, green, blue, red, which I've been informed is the same as a very talented Magic the Gathering streamer whose name is very close to an infamous Magic the Gathering dragon. So that's always feels nice to be on the same page. Anyway, Ambulatory Edifice I think might be a card that gets undervalued early on. A 3/2 for 3 is not a great stat block, and -1/-1 isn't usually that great. But this kills at least 25 creatures in the set, not to mention the 1/1 Mites, or if you use it post-combat to finish something off. Billowas Skull Dweller is a 1/1 Toxic Death Toucher. I stressed it earlier, and I'll stress it again. It is going to be important to race to Corrupted, and 1/1s for 1 that are toxic are going to be how you win that race. If your opponent is on the draw and keeps a slow hand where they aren't playing something till turn 3, cards like this are going to be devastating. A 1/1 Death Toucher also trades up very well in more defensive strategies, so I think it will end up being in a fair amount of decks. Chittering Skitterling definitely makes me think of Skullport Merchant back in AFR, where it was a mythic level uncommon. I'm not sure that it's going to be that level of power, but assuming that you can get Corrupted, a 1/4 blocks well, and this will be an excellent source of card draw for the strategies that lean towards outvaluing your opponent. Drown in Ichor is the 3rd busted removal for black. At least it's a sorcery speed, but -4/-4 is going to remove most of my opponent's threats, and it only costs 2 mana. That would be enough, honestly, but then they had to go and throw in a cheap way to proliferate. I'll be taking as many of these as I can. Thank you very much. Ravenous Necrotitan is a 6/6 for 2 and double pit black. There are a fair amount of cards that create cheap 1/1 tokens, like all of the cards that create Mites, for example, which make great sacrifice fodder. And if things are going to be as fast-paced as I believe, then hitting Corrupted by turn 4 should be reasonable as well. Then it's just a 6/6 for 4 with no downside. Scheming Aspirant is a 1/3 for 1 and a black that saps your opponent for 2 every time that you proliferate. This card is what gives me hope for an attrition-style deck, probably in Dimir. The 1/3 blocks well early, and that ability is going to add up when you are casting a proliferate spell every turn. Barbed Batterfist brings me to my last mechanic of the set, for Mirrodin. It's an equipment that summons a 2/2 token that comes into play with the equipment already attached to it. I think this is a great mechanic, since the problem with equipment is that you usually fall behind on the board to play an artifact instead of a creature, and this mechanic solves that problem, to an extent. A 2/2 isn't very good, but I think it'll make the equipment more playable. Barbed Batterfist is an equipment for 1 and a red with the 4 Mirrodin mechanic. Its equipment cost is 1, and the equipped creature gets +1/-1. So you get a 3/1 for 2 that leaves behind an equipment when it dies. I think if your deck isn't doing anything off the equipment strategy, then this becomes much closer to filler, but it has enough synergies that I thought it was worth a mention. Hex Gold Slash is Shock 2.0, and arguably the best removal in red if the format is very aggressive. There are a fair amount of cheap 1 and 2 cost combat tricks that this can 2 for 1, which would make it great even without its other ability. This thing also deals 4 damage for 1 mana to creatures that have Toxic, so you can trade way up on value in the value game. This card single-handedly breathes hope into what I think is the worst color in the set. Holdolfa Cackler is a 2/3 Trampler for 2 and a red. It gets +X/+0, where X is the number of permanents you control with oil counters on them. I really wish this read more along the lines of X is the number of oil counters you have. It'd be a big difference. I still think that this plays as a 3/3 or a 4/3 Trampler as long as you are in Timur or blue-red-green. If you don't have any oil, then this falls down to filler. Cacophony Scamp is going to do some silly things in Constructed. I've already seen people figuring out how to get turn 1 wins with this card. It's a 1/1 for 1 that if it damages a player, you can sacrifice it to proliferate when it and then also when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So in Constructed, you just need to get this to 10 power with haste, and then boom, game over. I like it in Limited for similar reasons to Malcator's Watcher. This can 2 for 1 early attackers from an opponent who's trying to get corrupted online ASAP. Also, it pairs nicely with combat tricks for a burst of damage. Volt Charge is also very appealing. Lightning Strike was good enough to make it into basically every red aggro deck in Constructed, and it was pretty busted in Limited. There are a lot of good removal options in this set, and it does cost 1 more mana than Lightning Strike, but it comes with Proliferate. I ended up using Excavation Explosion from Bro to finish off my opponent with 3 damage to the face, so there's always that option too. Furnace Punisher is a 3/3 Menace for 3. I think with how great the gold cards are, there won't be too many monocolor decks, but just a 3/3 Menace for 3 is a great stat block, and will apply a lot of pressure for the decks looking to beat down their opponents. Hexgold Halberd is a 4 Mirrodin equipment that seems pretty appealing as well. A 2/2 First Strike Trampler for 2 is definitely decent, and it leaves behind the equipment when it dies. It's a little expensive to equip, but giving a flying creature or menace creature or a death touch creature First Strike and Trample is going to be pretty fun. Rebel Salvo is also great removal. The set is not lacking removal, and that is for sure. Even at full cost, 5 damage for 3 is great, and if you happen to have equipment synergies, then this can be played for even cheaper. Now for green, I've heard people say that this is the best common in the set. Contagious Vorak. I'm not sure I'm ready to take that leap, but it's definitely a good card. It's a Centaur Courser that grabs you a land most of the time, and if you miss, or if you just don't feel like taking the land, then it triggers Proliferate. Ruthless Predation is Epic Confrontation from Bro. Epic Confrontation ended up being top quality filler, in my opinion, by the end of the set, and really what's holding this back is that it's sorcery speed. I think it might play a little bit better in 1, since cheap removal pairs really well with aggro, but only time will tell. My first impression is that you are going to want to grab this card though, especially if your main color is green, since it's really your only green removal at the common level. Now for the uncommons. And another side note, I think black and green are really strong colors, but most of their power is coming at the uncommon level. I'm not sure how many people will be able to realistically draft black and green, so I'm going to be trying to hop onto the Golgari train early and see if it's way too crowded. Armored Scrap Gorger might be my favorite card of the set at the uncommon level. A rainbow mana dork with graveyard hate that turns into a 3/3 later in the game? What more could you ask for? Maybe hexproof? I think I'm going to find myself splashing for some tasty gold cards as well, and this is a perfect way to splash or to ramp. Kinker Bloom is a grizzly bear with extra power. This also comes with the upside of being a disenchant that isn't completely worthless if your opponent has no artifacts or enchantments. And last but not least, it can proliferate if you need to grow that last poison counter to win the game. Some people have been raving about Evolving Adaptive. I think it would be fun to make a competition out of who could predict the mythic level uncommon or uncommons of the set. The Static Nets, the Skyfisher Spiders, the Third Path Iconoclasts, to use Bro as an example. It's always fun to speculate. I'm not sure if this is the card that's going to make it to the mythic level. A 1/1 that continues to grow, though, is certainly going to be a good card, but a mythic level uncommon? We'll see. Infectious Bite is a bite spell for 2 that gives your opponent a poison counter. Yes, please. Infectious Bite is going to be great. Instant speed too, so you can use this to activate Corrupted mid-combat or in response to a combat trick. This is the other removal spell of 2 in green, so I think it will get taken pretty early. Tyvar's Stand, I think, is going to be undervalued. I'm not exactly sure what it is about this card, but something tells me I'm going to see more of these late in the pack than I think I should. It's instant speed, so you can use it on an unblocked creature as a green blaze to deal X damage. You can also choose X to be 0 and play it like Safekeeping from Neo in response to removal. Or you can tweak your creature to the exact mount to win a combat. I think it's a great card, and I won't be passing it. Venomous Brutalizer is a good card, but I do think it has some problems that prevent it from absolute greatness. First off, it's double pip in green, so it really should be in your decks where green is your primary color, especially if you're going to be splashing for busted gold cards. I think the Proliferate ability is a bit overcosted. Other cards, I think, proliferates around a value of 1, but late game, it's nice to have the option. The biggest drawback is that this is the perfect target for Hexgold Slash, but those problems aside, a 4/4 for 4 that has Toxic 3 is definitely good. Flashback cards are great value cards because you get multiple things out of one card. Viral Spawning is 2 and a green to create a 3/3 Toxic Beast, and then if you have Corrupted, it has Flashback for 2 and a green. This feels like an upgraded version of Call of the Herd from Dominaria Remastered, as long as you have Corrupted. If you aren't planning on hitting Corrupted, then maybe don't play this card, but it's not like green is lacking any cards with Toxic. Now for the artifacts. The Skull Bombs range from great to not so great. They cost 1 colorless, and you can always cycle them for a card, but I think the ones that really shine are blue and white. Basilica Skull Bomb allows you to give a creature +2/+2 and flying while drawing a card. Depending on the matchup, sometimes the air is wide open, so this can help you push through damage to win the game. Surgical Skull Bomb is the other one that I'm interested in playing. I really wish I could pop this at instant speed, but I imagine it will play similar to Tolarian Geyser from DMU without the life gain. Tolarian Geyser was also sorcery speed, and you don't get the life gain, but bouncing something that has stalled out the game while drawing a card is not a bad option to have. The format might be too aggressive or too fast for this card, since you really want to be bouncing something that costs more than 3 for the value gain. Atraxa's Skitterfang is a 2/2 for 3 colorless that comes into play with 3 oil counters on it. You then can remove an oil counter at the beginning of combat to give a creature flying, vigilance, death touch, or lifelink until end of turn. I really like the versatility of this card, and since it's colorless, it fits into every deck. Giving a big trample creature death touch seems like a very achievable dream in this set, and this is one of those cards that is going to help me do it. Ichor Plate Golem is a 2/3 for 3 colorless that adds additional oil counters to your slippery creatures, and then gives all of your creatures with oil counters +1/+1. If you are in Timor, again, for the people not used to the MTG lingo, that's blue, green, and red, then you are going to want this lord. My magic number is 7 for synergy cards, but you can probably get away with 4 or 5 oily creatures and still get good value out of this card. Mirror Convert might win my favorite card flavor-wise. I don't know exactly why, but I really attached to Mirror Artifact decks when I was a young lad, and always loved the Phyrexia story arc. Together at last. That aside, a toxic 2/1 for 2 colorless is going to find itself in many decks, and the ability to use this, albeit a painful option, to splash a card is definitely going to happen. Here's another card that I think might be undervalued at the beginning of the set, Rib Skiff. Rib Skiff is a 4/4 vehicle with toxic 2 for 4 colorless. Its crew cost is 3, which is definitely on the expensive side, but it draws a card when it enters the battlefield. I also think some of the toxic strategies in green and white are going to hit a wall with their cheap toxic 1/1s, and so being able to put 3 of your mites into crewing this might be a good way to keep the toxic train a-rolling. Now for what I've been waiting for, or at least what I'm most excited for, the multicolored gold cards. Seriously, these things pack a punch, and it'll be a good time to talk about what each archetype is trying to do now that we've gotten a taste of what each color is doing. Boros, or red-white, is the 4 Mirrodin archetype. Bladehold Warwhip makes all of your other equipment abilities cost 1 less, and it gives all of your equipped creatures double strike. The equip cost is expensive, but a 2/2 double strike for 3 is great. Azorius, or white-blue, is all about artifacts. I think it was nice of them to make the 2 best skull bombs, the 1-cost artifacts from earlier, the white and the blue one. It's almost like they did it for a reason. Cephalopod Sentry brings back memories of Broodstar, like I said, Mirror Artifact kid, but back then the lands also counted towards your artifacts. I still think it won't be too difficult to get 3, and this, a 3/5 flyer for 4 is definitely good. Rakdos, or black-red, is the creature death archetype. Rakdos doesn't care which creatures are dying or how, but things tend to trigger when creatures die. Charforger creates a perfect little 1/1 sacrifice fodder. It's a 2/3 for 3, so you're getting 3/4 stats for 3, and it's spread over 2 bodies. And then every time a creature or artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, it gets an oil counter. Then if you remove 3 oil counters, you can use it to find extra cards. Gruul, or red-green, is all about that oil. I really want to have haste instead of vigilance, but Cinderlash Ravager is going to single-handedly destroy some might-y strategies. It's a 5/5 vigilance for 6 that costs 1 less for each permanent that has an oil counter on it, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. So I guess it not having haste isn't too bad, because you can play this after combat to finish off a couple of your opponent's threats. And I can't wait to clear a board of mites against my Orsov or Selesnya opponents. Also worth noting is that you don't need this to be discounted very much, and it seems very splashable. You should be able to get 1 or 2 knocked off the cost outside of an oil-based strategy, and worst case, a 5/5 vigilance for 6 that trimmers your opponent's board is not the end of the world. Golgari is the toxic proliferate strategy. If there is an archetype that aims to win by making your opponent hit 10 poison counters, it is Golgari. Necrogen Rot Priest is going to put your opponent in a tough spot. A 1/5 Death Toucher is you usually just let a 1/5 Death Toucher through for 1 damage a turn. But when it's giving you 3 poison counters each time, it becomes a much higher priority to block. It also gives you the ability to make any of your toxic creatures have Death Touch for 3 mana, and they all give an additional poison counter if they get through. Izzet is usually the spells matter archetype, and I don't think 1 is going to be an exception. It also has a bit of oil synergies thrown in. So Serum Core Chimera is a 2/4 flyer for 4 that has, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Serum Core Chimera. Then you can remove 3 oil counters to draw a card. Then discard a non-land card to deal 3 to a target creature or planeswalker at sorcery speed. I certainly have started putting a lot of text on these cards. I don't know about you, but I'm going to be doing my best strong bad impression every time that I play this card. We've got to get the serum through. Celestia, is green-white. It's also going for a toxic strategy, but I think you're more likely to beat your opponent through damage before getting them to 10 poison counters because of cards like Complete Devotion and this one. Slaughter Singer is a 2/2 for 2 with Toxic 2. Whenever another toxic creature you control attacks, it gets +1/+1. It's cards like this that make me a little nervous about the play versus the draw, but at least the set has plenty of removal. Simic, or green-blue, is the proliferate beatdown archetype. Whether it is poison or oil, Simic is all about proliferating those counters. Tainted Observer is a 2/3 toxic flyer for 3. It's a great evasive flyer with toxic, and being able to make every creature you play into an extra proliferate for 2 is great. Oh, and I forgot to mention, there are 10 planeswalkers in this set, so yeah, you can proliferate their counters too. Orsov, or white-black, is the archetype of Corrupted. Vivisection of Evangelist is a 4/4 vigilance for 5 that if you have Corrupted, which by turn 5 shouldn't be a problem, you get to destroy their best creature or planeswalker. Figuring out how to bounce this guy to continuously destroy their best things seems like something I want to achieve. But even if it's just a 4/4 afterward, it's still a decent stat block. And last but not least, we have Dimir, or blue-black. Dimir is the other spells matter archetype, so don't be afraid if your deck only has 10 or so creatures in it. I think Dimir is set up to run a very interesting playstyle, somewhere between tempo and control. Voidwing Hybrid is a 2/1 toxic flyer for 2, and each time you proliferate, you get to bring this back from your graveyard to your hand. So in summary, my color ranking is black, white, green, blue, red. Black has excellent removal and decent creatures, though a lot of its power is at the uncommon level. White is a very aggressive color, centered around quickly putting poison counters on your opponent. It has cheap combat tricks and removal, and is relatively deep with plenty of good commons to choose from. Green has great creatures, but it is a little limited in the interaction. Blue is very controlling, centered around counter spells, card draw, and tapping your opponent's creatures. Its creatures are a little lacking, but I think it looks like a great support color. Red looks a bit weaker than the other 4 colors, but it has really good damage-based removal, and should also make a great support color. Timur, or blue, green, red, is all about oil, and Sultai, blue, green, black, is all about proliferate. I think given the apparent power level of the gold cards, splashing is going to be very tempting, especially with Terramorphic Expanse, which is basically a reskinned Evolving Wilds. Dune Mover, which is a 2/1 toxic colorless creature for 2 that lets you look for any basic land and put it on the top of your library, which almost made this list, and Prophetic Prism. Next week, I'll be diving into one of the archetypes in greater detail after I've had a chance to play the set. Speaking of, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. It really helps me, and maybe one day I can even get early access. Thank you for enjoying my guide to All Will Be One, and thank you for all of the support. I'll see you next week.